I welcome Sonia and just say a few words about what Sonia's going to be talking about. Sonia's going to be with us till about 3:15, at which point she'll be racing back to another very interesting event in UMass along the same kind of theme, working with Latino students. But when Sonia leaves, I invite you to stay, and I'd like to just show you briefly some of the resources here, make sure that nobody leaves here without 2 bibliographies of resources, and just talk a little bit about the Holyoke Literacy Network. But first, we will have the next hour with Sonia Nieto, and Sonia's a professor at UMass and the director of the curriculum. You better say it.
I'm not director.
Oh, you're not. Oh, okay. She works in this program.
Yeah,
right. Cultural diversity and free. And Sonia's been working around issues of Latino students and all students for many, many years. And I've always felt supported as a person in practice working in this community by the kinds of work that Sonia's been doing. I feel like it's very hard, the work that many of us are doing. And Sonia's message is a very positive message in a sea of negativity. I feel that her work has helped us look towards positive directions we can move in instead of looking at what all the problems are. And I was just, I brought two of Sonia's books here. This is a collection of writings by many people working with Latino students in Massachusetts, and this is for diversity. And this book was what helped me think about what I was hoping Sonia would focus on today. There's a collection of really good articles in here, and Sonia wraps it up at the end and the title of the chapter is Creating Possibilities. And one of the early things it said was it's time for us to move on from research to action. And as a person who's I'm also studying some, and there's a lot of research out there. We know a lot, and I think we know what's the right thing to do. So without any further ado, I welcome Sonia Nieto.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm going to, if it's okay, I'm going to stay here and sort of lean on this. I can put my notes. Let me say something about where I am, the Cultural Diversity Curriculum Reform Program. For years, I kept wondering why everybody was introducing me as Associate Professor and Director of the Cultural Diversity Curriculum Reform Program when I'm now a full professor and I haven't been director of it for years. And then, of course, it occurred to me that that's what it says on the book. And I realized that. But anyway, I'm glad to say I'm no longer the director of the program. It's a rotating thing, so I haven't done that for many years. Let's see, there was something else I want to say about what Kim mentioned. Oh, I think it's interesting that in this article that you talked about, this creating possibilities, that I, as a researcher, should say we have enough research. But I do believe part of that. I think that we have enough research, certainly, to start action. Doesn't mean that we need to finish with research or that we need to deny anything new that comes along. But we certainly know a lot, and we certainly put it into practice. So, let's see, let me tell you what I'll be talking about, sharing some of these things with you, and then I hope that we can have a conversation. Partly this is from this chapter called Creating Possibilities, Educating Latino Students in Massachusetts. And partly it's from a very extensive chapter that I wrote that's called The History of the Education of Puerto Ricans in U.S. mainline schools, Losers, Outsiders, or Leaders. That is in a book, it's a huge book, it's called Handbook of Research on Multicultural Education. It just came out. This is not light reading. I wouldn't recommend picking it up. It costs $75. It's a library resource, definitely. So most libraries, at least academic libraries, will have it. But in this chapter, what I did was to review a lot of the research that's been done on the education of Puerto Ricans in the United States, sort of a historical overview. in the last 50 or 60 years. And so my remarks today will be based on both of these things. I also appreciate what Kim said about the positive message. And what I would add to that is that I don't think that we need to deny or negate or overlook all the negative things. Those are things that we see every day, and we certainly know that they're happening. We need to always keep them in the forefront. However, we also need to think about the possibilities, and that's why I titled this chapter that I wrote, Creating Possibilities, because we're always talking about failure. And we need to start thinking about what the possibilities that are out there, given the resources that we have, and also given the resources that we don't have, that we should have, that we must have in order to do this kind of work. So, these chapters that I wrote are based on the premise that we need to reconceptualize our society's responsibility for educating Latino youth, and that it can only take place when schools and other institutions basically look critically at their own policies and practices. So that means that knowing that there are certain things that we cannot change, and rather than focusing on those things that we can't change and blaming those things, moving on to what we can do something about. Because for many years, since I was a kid growing up here, not in Holyoke, in New York City, I remember people complaining about, well, Puerto Ricans don't care about education. Well, they don't have, if they don't have a father in the home, or they're poor, and some of these things may be true, but we can't really change them. We can't change those things. We can work for social justice, of course, in which those things might be changed. But in the meantime, we can't find fathers for a lot of children. That's not something that we as educators do. So we have to think of what we can do with the resources that we have and with those that we deserve. And we also need to start with the question, what do we know about the school experiences of Latino youth in the United States in order to answer the question, what works for Latino youth and how can we bring it about? And in fact, I want to point out in this, in this book, there's a chapter called What Do Latino Students Need? I think it's called. And it's by Antonia Darder and Carol Upshur. And what they did was to do a very extensive study of four schools in the Boston area. In Boston, actually, right in Boston. And it was really interesting to see what they found that students see. Maybe I'll mention some of that later on. So let me start out with the bad news, most of the bad news. That is, what do we know? I think we need to not overlook, as I said, or not dismiss what we know. So what do we know? We know a lot of dismal statistics on the education of Latino youth, and I'd like to sort of review some of these with you. We know that Latinos are one of the most undereducated groups in the United States. Now, it's also important to look at Latino groups by ethnicity. That is, that sometimes what's true of one Latino group, Puerto Ricans, for example, may not be true of Mexican Americans or Chicanos, or may not be true of Central and South Americans or Cubans. While we have many things in common, there are some things that are not true. So, for example, there are some vast differences. For example, Mexican Americans are the most likely Latino group to not have a high school education. And I think that has to do with the fact that many come either not having gone to school before or are agricultural workers, and so therefore are in and out of school a lot. That's important to know. Puerto Rican youth, on the other hand, have the highest poverty rate of all Latino youngsters. That's important to know. Almost 12% of Latinos have less than a 5th grade education. just over half of Latinos have high school degrees. Now that's compared to about 85% of European Americans or whites. Only 9% of Latinos have a college education, a BA or a BS. 9% compared to about 25% of European Americans. Now we also know that academic achievement levels among Latinos have improved since the 1970s, but they continue to lag way behind the national average. For example, only 37% of Latinos are enrolled in algebra or accelerated math classes, but they're twice as likely as whites to be enrolled in remedial math classes. So this issue of tracking is a very important one for Latinos that keeps a lot of Latinos in a really subservient position in terms of their academic achievement. The scores of Latinos on the SAT have also improved since the 1970s, but they're still at least 40% below the national average. We also know that class issues are very important. They have a lot to do with, but they can't completely explain the fact that Latinos don't achieve as much. So, for example, in 1992, 44% of Latinos from low-income families dropped out. 44%, incredible number. But there were 25% from middle-income families and almost 10% from high-income families who also dropped out. And those numbers are also higher for Latinos. That is, if you compare Latinos of middle-class families and of upper-income families with non-Latinos of middle-class families and upper-income families, the dropout rate for Latinos is still higher. So it's not only social class. Yes, poverty has a lot to do with it. Certainly has a lot to do with it, but it's not only that. So, and I'll go over with you some things that the researchers are thinking that might count for this. Okay, the second thing that we know is that the larger socio-political context, both of school and non-school factors, significantly affects Latino children's experiences at school. I mentioned the poverty rate. 40% of Latino children under 18 live in poverty. 40%. That's of all Latino youth. For Puerto Rican children, it's 52% nationally. We also know that in terms of that larger socio-political context, that large urban school districts, which have the highest Latino enrollment, our community is very urban. The Latino community in general is very urban. Whether we're talking about Mexican, which has more of a diverse background, both urban and rural, but certain Puerto Ricans, Cubans, and other Central and South Americans, very urban community, and we know that urban school systems are the most strapped financially and the ones that receive the least resources. So that means that it's a double whammy for Latino kids and African American kids who live in urban areas. We also know that Latino children are the most segregated of any other group in their schools. 73% of Latino students attend predominantly what are called minority schools. It's the most segregated community. It's no longer the African American community that's the most segregated, but the Latino community that's the most segregated. In terms of the socio-political context, we also know that the number of Latino teachers and administrators and other professionals in the schools has been extraordinarily low. It's about 3%. And of that 3%, I don't know the exact numbers, but I would venture to say that about 90% is bilingual programs. So if we were to eliminate bilingual education today, which I know that there's certainly some sentiment for that in the state and in the nation, we would probably end up with a fraction of 1% of Latino teachers. Latinos are also more likely than any other ethnic group to who report the presence of street gangs and of violence in their schools. So they feel this violence more than any other group. The ability to speak English is a significant factor in a student's capacity to stay in school. That is, once students do speak English, they tend to, makes a lot of sense, they tend to do better in school. That doesn't mean that that means in fact that in order to learn English, they have to be in programs that support their acquisition of English while supporting their acquisition of content. Because you can't just have them learning English all day long if they're not learning other content. And that's usually the native language. The number of students of limited English proficiency in the United States has just skyrocketed in the last several years. From 1984 to 1992, there was a 70% increase of students of limited English proficiency. The number is now over 2 million. However, 45% of the districts with these students offered no instruction that used their native language. 45%. And finally, in terms of the socio-political context, we know that retention doesn't seem to work, that is keeping kids back a grade. Kids who are retained between 7th and 9th grade have a much higher rate of dropping out than kids who are not retained. Okay, what is the third thing that we know? We know that promising practices are widely known, and that new research is helpful, but the practical reforms have to be put into practice. And I think that probably more than anything else, this is the message that I would leave you with today. That most studies and most research look at students as what I've called walking sets of deficiencies. That is, that there is something terribly wrong with the student, how can we fix him or her? Rather than schools looking critically at their own policies and practices as contributing factors, it is what do schools do, schools and other institutions, what do they do to produce failure? Failure is not produced out of the air. It responds to certain situations. And schools and other institutions certainly have something to do with this. I say that because although these statistics are terrible, and the reality of kids of living in poverty and living with violence and all of these things, these are terrible things. But some kids who live in those very same conditions do okay, right? If it were just awful, just terrible, and then that would not explain at all how some kids are able to do it. And in fact, we've even seen kids who are faring worse than others, and yet they're able to do well. Sometimes that's because of personal initiative. That's absolutely true. And we all know kids who are resilient and who can overcome any barriers. I don't think we should look at it as an individual thing, because that puts too much pressure on people to individually have to overcome incredible barriers that we don't ask usually our middle-class kids or kids who have more fortunate circumstances. We don't ask them to have to overcome such barriers. Some kids do anyway. But there are other kids who just happen to be fortunate in terms of the schools that they attend, in terms of the teachers who they have. Just the other day, 2 days ago, I had talk about positive experiences. I was teaching a class, and I had it was the day in which about 5 of the students reported on their visits to teachers' classrooms. They had tried to find teachers who had been identified as excellent teachers who taught with a multicultural perspective, and so they went to these 5 different teachers and they reported back. And it was such an uplifting class. It was really wonderful because While we do need to know the bad news, there's a lot of good news out there too that we often don't get. And here are teachers who, in spite of some of these conditions, are doing wonderful things. Now, in all of these cases, these are schools that are quite well endowed, actually, and so they have the resources. They also have kids who have not done well in school, and the teachers have done wonderful things because of their own attitudes and their own behaviors with the kids. So, and even in school systems that don't have a great many resources, we have powerful examples of young people who do well in spite of the fact that they look identical to other kids down the block who happen to be going to other schools. So for example, if we look at a school like Central Park East High School, which some of you may have heard of, it's in Latino, New York, Spanish Harlem. They get kids from the neighborhood. They do interview them, but they don't select based on grades or anything else. And they've just changed their policies and practices so much so that kids can succeed in school. They have an incredible rate of 70% of the kids go on to college. Now these are the same kids that are going to the school down the street, so there must be something that they're doing that helps that happen. And they'll be the first to say that it's not easy. There are terrible challenges sometimes, but they are able to do it. So, fourth, we know that the major problems in Latino education that have been documented over the past 50 years are constant and recurring. And this I found in looking at the research that I was looking at, and that's why I called it From Losers to Outsiders, Losers, Outsiders, or Leaders, because I looked at, actually I knew about this report a long time ago, a report called The Losers, and it was about Puerto Rican youth in New York City and in New Jersey public schools, and it was from 1968. It's an excellent report in spite of the title's name. It was called that because the writer said we're all the losers because all these kids are losing the opportunity to be productive human beings. There were reports in New York City, which is where the bulk of the Puerto Rican community was at that time. About 90% of all Puerto Ricans lived in New York at that time, in the 1940s. There were reports in the 1940s and the 1950s. There was a huge, massive undertaking, a study that was done from 1953 to 1957 called the Puerto Rican Study. I was in school then, actually, in elementary school at that point in New York City. So, this was one of the schools where I was at. So it's been studied for a long time. And the dropout crisis has been a constant and recurring problem. And although in some areas the education of Puerto Rican youth has gotten better, this is one area where it hasn't. Puerto Ricans have the highest dropout rate of any other Latinos. It's hovered between 50 and 60%. That means that between 50 and 60 of every 100 students who start in 9th grade, they don't finish in 12th grade. And you may see other numbers, and it means that they look at the numbers yearly. So they'll say 10%, 15%, so on, yearly may drop out. And it hasn't gotten better. In fact, I was looking at some data from 1972, and the dropout rate in 1992 was a few points higher, a few decimal points higher. So the numbers are really extraordinarily high. Another of the major problems or major issues are language issues. Now, unfortunately, the social and political context has determined that these issues get addressed as problems, that is, language problems. There's a language barrier, that the kids don't speak English. I often give the example of when I started to teach in New York City, it was in 1966. and I was a teacher in the junior high school there, and they called me the NE teacher, which meant the non-English teacher. It wasn't until years later that I really started to question it and say, my English is perfectly fine, but not only did they label the kids, they labeled me. Because the NE teacher meant that I was the teacher of the kids who didn't speak English, which basically were Puerto Rican kids. So I was the NE teacher. And so as I said, not only did they label the kids, they labeled me, which is, I think, a real insult, but it's also an insult to the kids because it's not just that they are non-something. They are also something. And often we only think about what they're not instead of what they are, right? And I think we need to say that kids are Spanish speaking, or Korean speaking, or Japanese speaking, or whatever other language that they speak. And so even the terms that we use, I can say something about our perspective, or about our philosophical viewpoint about what kids bring. The third major problem in Latino education that's been documented over the years is poor academic achievement, and I've given you some indication of that. And fourth is the lack of parental involvement. And in every single report that we see that's addressed in different ways sometimes. Sometimes it's that parents are not as involved as they should be, and we need to get them involved. At other points, it's parents are not involved because they don't care about the education of their kids. So certain assumptions are made. Although every report says it's really important for parents to be involved. It's really important. So, and I think that is actually a very major issue, especially because we often begin with the assumption that parents don't have very much to bring to the education of their children. We think, well, they're not educated, so what can they bring? You know? And that, I shouldn't say we, most of us here don't think that, but I think as a society we often think that. I remember when I did my doctoral work, my dissertation was precisely on that, on Puerto Rican parents, in terms of how they could be involved in curriculum decision-making in schools. And when I went to present it at the American Educational Research Association meeting, that was the first time I ever went to that annual conference, that 9,000 educational researchers go every year, and I swore I would never go back. Because not only did anybody look like me, or actually, I probably actually looked like a few women who were around. It was a very white place, and also nobody had the kind of name that I had or did the kind of research that I was interested in, and it was mostly male. It's really changed a lot of what I say over the years. But when I did my presentation, the discussants on the panel said, well, this is all very interesting research, but let's face it, Puerto Rican parents are mostly uneducated. What can they do in terms of curriculum decision-making? And of course, my whole premise is that everybody has something to bring. And that if we don't believe it, that's how we shut doors. And then we say, or society says, or many schools say, they're not interested. Of course, with that kind of attitude, who would want to go in and say, I want to help in my child's education? Because what we've assumed is that the best way to help children in their education is, and I think this, as a society we assume this, that we need to take them to libraries, we need to read them stories at night, we need to take them to museums, and we need to have lots of toys in the house. Those are all fine. Those are all good things to do. I didn't have any of those things. Well, I shouldn't say any. Actually, this library reminds me very much of the library I used to go to as a little kid in Brooklyn, and I just loved it. So I did get to go to the library. But the other things I didn't really have. And that, it doesn't mean that kids shouldn't have them. Of course, kids should have them. But that even if you don't have them, there are other things that parents can do and that we can encourage them to do. And other things that schools can do. And it's not only It shouldn't only be the kinds of activities in which middle-class parents are involved and have the resources for that we think are valuable for their children's education. We also know that certain policies and practices have consistently been shown to be more effective than others. And I know this is going to sound, this first one that I have is going to sound so silly, but I'll say it and then I'll explain what I mean. The first is lack of prejudice against Latinos. Of course, doesn't it make sense that kids will do better in school if they feel that there's not prejudice or not racist attitudes or behaviors against them? But remember before when I said that Latinos, no matter what socioeconomic level, drop out at higher rates than any other kids from any other backgrounds? That seems to be the deciding factor. I said I would get back to it. Well, this is it. That researchers who've done work on this have drawn the conclusion that perhaps it's because students don't feel that they belong in school, that they don't feel that there's a place for them, and that that they feel their teachers and schools in general are not welcoming places for them. In the research that's also in this blue book that I did with my colleague Manuel Ramos, which was a study of dropouts among Puerto Rican youths in the Holyoke public schools, we found, by the way, that the dropout rate, 68% Puerto Rican kids in Holyoke. And we called it "I Was an Outsider," dropping out among Puerto Rican youth in the Holyoke Massachusetts schools. We called it that because Manuel actually interviewed a small number of students to find out why they had dropped out of school, or for those who hadn't, why they hadn't dropped out of school. And one of the students said, "I was an outsider," saying that he did not feel, three young men asked him, that he didn't feel that he belonged in the school. And he also said, "No eran los míos." He said, "They weren't my people. No eran los míos." And when he was asked, or another student was asked, or another former student was asked, what would you have done to make school better for the Puerto Rican students? He said, hacer algo para que los boricuas no se sientan aparte. To do something so Puerto Ricans don't feel so separated or alienated. So there is something to this about feeling left out or not feeling that they belong. Another thing that seems to work, and this is very related, is that when students feel that they're supported in terms of their language and culture, they tend to do better in school. That also seems pretty reasonable, doesn't it? And yet, it doesn't always happen. When kids not only are not supported in their language and culture, but are told that they can't speak the language and culture, they can't speak the language in school, they can't be who they are in school. Many of us, when we went to school, got the message that what we were at home was to be left at the classroom door, and that was for home, and everything else, school was for studying and learning, and those two were very separate. And what I would suggest, given all the research that's been done, is that we can't make those divisions. We simply cannot make those divisions. It's like asking young people to leave a part of themselves at the door, and we can't separate ourselves like that. So one way that this happens is through bilingual programs, and of course they've received a lot of attention and a lot of very negative attention, I would say, in spite of the fact that most studies have shown that bilingual education programs work to keep kids in school. They act as what's been called a buffer. That is, they are a buffer to help kids feel that they belong, that there's a place for them, and because of that buffer, it helps to keep them in school. Most programs have found, most of the data on kids from bilingual programs has found that they have higher attendance rates, less truancy, and higher graduation rates. In the study that I did with Manuel Ramos, we found, as I mentioned before, that the dropout rate among Puerto Ricans in Holyoke is 68%. for those students who had at one time been in a bilingual program, the dropout rate was 39%. That's extraordinary, you know? And yet, there is so much negativity against bilingual programs. Obviously, they're doing something right. You know, which is not to say that there are no problems in bilingual programs. You know, but when we use the same yardstick to critique regular education programs, then I'll be happy. When we say, why aren't these kids in regular programs getting the kind of things that they should get, just the way that we hear all the time about bilingual programs, then that'll be fine. In other words, there are programs, there are problems in all sorts of programs. And all programs, of course, we have a human factor, so there are mistakes made and, you know, so on and so forth. But in general, bilingual programs tend to be more effective in keeping kids in school and helping them graduate and teaching them English, because that's something else that sounds sort of counterintuitive. That is, that it doesn't sound like it makes sense, and yet it's very sensible that kids who are in bilingual programs learn English better than kids who are in sink or swim type programs. You know, they're just placed in programs where they're not given any language support whatsoever. We also know that another policy has to do with curriculum, and the curriculum often marginalizes Latino students, and it doesn't reflect their culture and experiences. So we have a lot of examples of that. For example, Castilian Spanish is often the model for the Spanish that's taught in the school. So if kids take Spanish, you know, I was talking to one of my students the other day who was saying that in his system, what they're doing is placing the Puerto Rican kids in the Spanish classes. They think that's the way to avoid having a bilingual program. So at the high school level, they place them in the Spanish classes. But anyway, that's another story. It's really interesting. But a lot of Puerto Rican and other Latino kids end up taking Spanish because I think they think, finally, I'll be successful here. Finally, I can use my language. And they often have teachers who are not fluent speakers of Spanish teaching Spanish, or teachers who learned it as a second language, and demanding that the kids speak in a way that's foreign to them. That they say words that are only used in other regions, and not how they have grown up with, or accents, like Castilian accent, which is, you know, so foreign to them. And so often we find Puerto Rican kids dropping out or failing Spanish classes, and that's pretty good. I'm really glad to see that you have a resource list here for children's literature, and that you've included books about the Puerto Rican experience, because often, I've done a lot of research on this, and until very recently, most books that had any Puerto Rican characters were often demeaning, stereotypical, incomplete, you know, and so on. And I think that's changing now. It's more, I think one of the things that's happening is that more Latino authors are writing, and that's certainly helping it, although that alone isn't doing it. I think that there's a general consciousness about this, because a lot of us have been pushing for years about getting more authentic and respectful literature out there for children that affirms them rather than stereotypes them even further. You know, little things like in a lot of these stories in the past, and some of the present still, they would use Spanish as a prop. You know, they would say, oh, sí, amigo, my mamá says, you know, and so they would just sprinkle in little Spanish words in a way that we never use Spanish. So it would, and there would be all sorts of errors in the Spanish that was used. You know, accents misplaced, misspellings, and so on. Something that would never happen in the English language versions. Often students' everyday lives are overlooked in the curriculum. That is, if you look at most school curriculum, and again, it's changing, but very slowly, it doesn't rely on or build on what students already bring, because the assumption that I mentioned before is that students only have deficiencies, not that they have talents and strengths that they also bring to the educational experience. And yet we know everybody has talents and experiences that they can bring, but that's often not used. There's a researcher by the name of Luis Moll who has done some wonderful work on, what do they call it, on funds of knowledge, F-U-N-D-S, funds of knowledge. And he was saying that he actually works in Arizona, but he's Puerto Rican, and he had gone back home to Puerto Rico at one point, and was on his father. His father says, "Bueno, Luisito, ¿qué es lo que tú haces? What is it that you're doing? What kind of research are you doing?" So he was explaining to him that he was doing this thing on funds of knowledge, and his father said, "Well, what's that?" And he said, "Well, it assumes that parents have skills, parents and families have skills and experiences that we can learn from." And Luis said that his father said, "So why do you have to do research on that?" He said it's such an eye-opening question to him, and yet we're always in this deficit position that we have to prove that what our families bring can be helpful. It's unbelievable. And he was saying to his father, like we have carpenters, so they can come in and they can teach children not only about making things, but math, science, And his father was puzzled. He said, "Well, I don't understand why you have to prove that." Very interesting. So I think the curriculum certainly needs to be expanded. We also know that pedagogical strategies are sometimes not the best ones that can be used with Puerto Rican or Latino kids. That is how we teach. One of the reasons is that in many cases, Puerto Rican and other Latino kids, and poor kids actually of all backgrounds, get the teachers who are least experienced. And that's generally true. The teachers who, and often teachers who don't want to be there. It doesn't mean that there aren't some wonderful teachers in the schools, but often it's teachers who don't, at least who are starting, who don't necessarily want to be there, or even those who do want to be there, but who have a limited range of skills because they don't have the experience. The other thing is that a lot of teachers, or some teachers, know very little about their students' background, and then they make inappropriate assumptions about those backgrounds. I often remember, for example, my sister and I, she's a year older than I am, and when we were in school, we were both really skinny. And we ate very well, but we just happened to, that was our body type, And one day, her fifth grade teacher, who was a very good teacher actually, really, seemed to care about the kids at the time. And this was one example, I suppose. He went to my mother and said, "Ms. Cortez, I'm really concerned about your daughter. She looks very thin, and I just want to make sure that she's eating properly." And he gave her a list of the 7 basic foods. Now, it used to be 7 basic foods. We're now down to 4. But nothing that we ate was on that list. So not only did we feel bad because we were skinny, but then we felt that we weren't represented there at all. Where was the rice and beans, and where were the plátanos and the yatía, and all the things that we ate, it wasn't there. So of course we assumed that there was something wrong with us, rather than assuming that there's something wrong with the list. The lists have changed a bit, and now we know that rice and beans is like the perfect meal. But at the time, the perfect meal, at least for breakfast, was bacon and eggs and white bread. We know that that's pretty bad, pretty bad. So things change. So the other thing that has happened is that in the last 2 decades, there's been such an explosion around this whole issue of assessment and using assessment, that is achievement tests, particularly for what's called high stakes testing, it's called, which is that if very important decisions are made on the basis of one test. Now we know what those things are. For example, the SAT is high stakes testing. Students take the SAT, and how they do there will determine what college they get into, basically, in some places. That's high stakes testing. And because of that, teachers are sort of put in a bind where they feel that they have to prepare their kids for this kind of test, and they go through, their pedagogy suffers as a result. That is the way that they teach. And in fact, research has now found that in the last 20 years, because of this preoccupation with testing, there's been less creative pedagogy. That is, less student activities, student projects, debates, journal writing, and so on. In some places, that's been diminished. Okay, I want to leave a little time, so I just want to very briefly mention a few things that I think that would characterize a school that would work with Latino youngsters. What would that look like? Okay? And that's what I did in that article. So I'll just read you some of these things. It would be really bilingual. That is, it wouldn't use language as a bridge, but as a destination. The language would be understood as a resource and not a problem, and students should be encouraged for speaking their language, not punished or seen as deficient for doing so. This school would begin where students are at and go from there. It would be based on respect and solidarity for students' lives and experiences. This school would be multicultural in curriculum and in strategies. It would teach Latino students that they live in a diverse world and that they can benefit from it. And I should also say that it would teach them that Latinos have a lot to offer, but so does everybody else. In other words, it wouldn't just stay there with their own background. It would encourage and invite all sorts of parents' involvement. It would seek alternatives to ability grouping. It would promote student involvement in all activities, including governance, like student government and so on, and the development of disciplinary policies. It would reconsider retention policies. That is, holding kids back. It would connect students' real lives with their school lives. So, for example, there would be community service projects, school transition projects, etc. It would encourage students to develop critical analysis about everything. The staff of the school would be diverse, reflecting the students' cultures and languages. And finally, it would be a joyful place where students would be loved, where learning would be celebrated, and expectations would have no limits. One of the things that I'm always struck by is when you hear Latino students talk about what they want from their teachers, they say, I want them to love me. It's very interesting. That word comes up again and again and again with Latino youngsters. You might not think so, and you see some tough kids walking down the street that you think that the last thing that they wanted is love, and yet they're able to articulate that in some settings, that that's what they want, that they feel that they need support. I want to tell you about one kid and just read you some things that he said, and then I'll finish with that. This is actually not a Puerto Rican kid, but a Chicano, Mexican-American kid. And his name, or the name that we gave him, is Paul Chavez. In my other book, which includes case studies of 10 kids who've been successful in school, we have these pretty extensive case studies that talk about their backgrounds, their experiences, and how they feel in school, and so on. And so that book is actually being revised right now, and the new one is coming out in August. And it's going to include 2 new case studies, and the case studies are of kids who have not been successful in school. And so I have a young man from Boston who's African American, and a young man from East LA, California, who is Chicano. And what was interesting is that both of them are now in alternative schools. Again, we didn't go looking for that necessarily, but these young men are in alternative schools, and they have both been kicked out of schools. They've been, expelled. They've failed out. Paul is in a gang. He's had an uncle die, and I think a cousin be killed. In that, because of the gang activity, he's been in jail. He's 16 years old. And he's now in this alternative school that is doing wonderful things. So I want to read you some of the words that he said when he was interviewed by my friend Mac Morante, who lives out there in California. Because I think that it's really interesting if you listen to the words that kids say, they get at all the policies and practices that I've been talking about. So I wanted to just read you what he says. And in fact, one researcher once said that if you listen to kids carefully, they reinforce what all the experts are saying about education and about what needs to happen. So remember, the policies and practices that I'm talking about are things like curriculum and pedagogy, tracking and ability grouping, parent involvement, student involvement, all these things, and he refers to almost every single one of them. So he says about his alternative school, which I've called La Comunidad School, but it has some really wonderful name, which they said they'd mind if we use, which is Mujeres y Hombres con Honor, is the name of the school. Women and men with honor. Honorable men and women. Honorable women and men. So he says, I was here when they barely opened the school, and I brought my mom and my dad, and we had a couple of kids here, the staff here. What we did was wrote all the rules, right? Parent involvement and student involvement. Just made an outline of how the school was going to be. People were going to get treated right. Everything was done with each other, you know? It wasn't just talked about with the staff and brought to the students, it was the students and the staff. Then he talks about affirming students' cultures and teaching them about their background. This is what he says. They get more into deeper Latino history here, and that's what I like. A lot of other, how you say, ethnic background, so it's multicultural. Remember what I said before? I never used to think about being Chicano before. Now I do. For me, as far as being Chicano, it's prideful. It's pride of your race, what you are. Parent involvement, he talks about. I think they should get more of these aides, assistants, to be parents, okay? Because parents, I noticed this. A parent in school is more like they got love. That's it. They got love and they give it to you. Parents have a lot of things to say, I would think, about the schools. This is about the pedagogy now. He says, the classes should have more better learning techniques. Teachers should not think of a lesson as a lesson. Think of it not as a lesson just being taught to students, but a lesson being taught to one of your own family members. He said, because if it's like that, students get more into it, and that's all it takes. Teach a lesson with heart behind it. Then teachers' attitudes. We talked about racism before, the kinds of the prejudice that teachers feel towards students. He says, you can't get a teacher, put them in a classroom with a bunch of kids from the neighborhood, and the teacher lives in another neighborhood and expect that person to understand. I have problems at home, a lot of problems. And to come into school and for a teacher to come with a snotty attitude, I'm going to give it back. That's the way it is. So those are the things that Paul says, and I think that we can learn a lot from that. We also need to remember that schools alone can't do it. That, and I'm certainly not suggesting that only teachers are to blame or the schools are to blame. I think society is really to blame. The families, the schools, that all of us have some part in this, and we all need to work harder at it but we need to look particularly at how the conditions in society are creating failure. And there are very few opportunities for young people now. Our whole economic system is undergoing some massive structural changes, leaving some people just squeezed out. I think we need to look at low expectations as low expectations of society, not just low expectations of school. And we can't just look at disintegrating families. We need to look at how society is helping families to disintegrate. And it's not just that the families are to blame either. So schools can't do it all, but they can do something to counteract the negative values and the lure of the street gangs, the violence, and the crime. I was very touched by Paul's story, as I hope you are. But Paul is not alone. Paul's not the only one. If you look in all the schools, we see hundreds of Pauls. They're all there, and I think they all have something to teach us. And it was depressing to me when I went back to Mac, and he had gone back to show Paul the case study that we did and everything. I said, how's Paul doing? He said, well, I don't know, he's doing really better, and I don't know if he's going to succumb to the gangs. I just don't know if he's going to make it. So I think that, I just wrote a paper that's called On the Brink Between Triumph and Disaster, and it's about Paul and Ron, the other young man, and I think that Paul and Ron are both on the brink between triumph and disaster, but that they're not the only ones. Our schools are, and our society is as well. And I think that we need to do things to make sure that Paul does triumph. This is how I ended that paper, and so how I'll end this as well. These are Paul's words again about his hopes for the future. He says, I don't want to speak too soon, but I'm pretty much on a good road here. I'm pretty much making it, trying to make something out of myself. I'm on that way, I'm going that way. You can't talk about next month, at least at this time. I'm just today, get it done. That's it, the best I can. And I'm tripping out on myself. I don't believe I'm doing this. But I don't really like to build myself too high, because the higher you are, the harder you're going to fall. I don't want to fall. So, those are Paul's words, and that's my message to you. Thank you. Let's talk. Any comments or questions or?
Yes. A lot of people compare adjustment to, mainland American life. For Puerto Ricans, they compare it to the immigration of the 30s and 40s and how immigrants from all over, came here, didn't speak the language, learned, went to school. And I'm wondering if you have any sense of how much of that is myth, or is there something qualifiably different between Puerto Ricans and, the other immigrants or conditions?
That's a very good question. I remember that one of our students a long time ago wrote a paper. It was one of my favorite titles. It was, my parents made it without bilingual education. Most of them were good parents. And it's about second and third generation immigrants. I think it's very typical in our society to generalize the experience of European Americans to all groups. And that's very problematic, because the experience has been entirely different. Let me tell you some of the ways that it's been different, at least for Puerto Ricans, and I would say for other groups as well. First of all, our society was a very different society at the beginning of the century. We had the massive immigration. It was a time where you could get a job if you had a strong back. It was a time where one person could support the family, not two people. I don't know how many of you, I assume that all of you are working, most of you are women. And that wasn't always the case. That was usually the case in the 1900s and the teens and the 20s. There was a time where those people did not make it. They did not make it. The high school dropout rate was extraordinarily high, but the kids made it because they were able to get jobs in places where they didn't need to either speak the language or have an education. And they made sure that their kids got the education, and the schools made sure that they got the education. So those are some of the differences. I also think that it's important to point out that for European immigrants, for the most part, immigration was a life-transforming final experience. For Puerto Ricans, it is an everyday occurrence. It's a back-and-forth movement, and that has to do with our status as U.S. citizens. Puerto Ricans come here as U.S. citizens, not as immigrants. We call migrants in the sense that we're in the same political system. And so, which is not to say that Puerto Ricans don't want to learn English. I've never known a Puerto Rican who said, I don't want my child to learn English. I've never in my life met anybody who lives in any Puerto Rican who lives in this country who has said that, ever. So of course, English is important, but so is maintaining Spanish. Because you need to maintain Spanish if you keep going back and forth like that, and to maintain the family ties. our economic, the economy is going through massive structural changes right now, and it's not allowing the kinds of opportunities that the parents and grandparents of Europeans had, of European immigrants had. And so that's something else that we need to keep in mind. And finally, the issue of race can't be denied. That is, the experiences of people of color have tended to be quite different from the experiences of European Americans because you can blend in after one generation, right? And so if your parents had a Polish accent, it doesn't matter if you speak English perfectly, you'll be seen as American. You know, and yet how many times have I met Asians, for example, who've been here for 5 generations, and people always say to them, where are you from? You know, what are you? I'm American. No, but I mean really, you know. Now, does that happen to Polish immigrants? Never. I mean, unless they have an accent. I'm talking about the second generation. So I think the issue of race is an important one as well. I think there's some interesting work by an anthropologist by the name of John Osgood, and he suggests that there are differences between two kinds of, well, he has 3 kinds of immigrants. I'll focus on 2. What he calls voluntary minorities and involuntary minorities. And of course, the third is the regular immigrants, who are the European immigrants who came over and who had that experience that people are trying to generalize to all of us, and it just doesn't work. He says, why do voluntary minorities have a better time or more successful in school than what he calls involuntary minorities? The involuntary minorities are African Americans, Native Americans, Puerto Ricans, and who else? And Mexican Americans. Thank you, Anne. I knew I would look over there. And these are all people who have been colonized or conquered, or enslaved. So Africans were brought over against their will. Native people were colonized here. Mexicans were colonized, and so all of the Southwest now was Mexico before, you know. Puerto Ricans were colonized. And so these are the groups that have the most difficult time because they're in a subservient, colonized, dominated position. There are other people of color who come here as immigrants, those who come from Africa, those who come from other parts of the Caribbean. Usually, it doesn't always work, this theory, but I think it's an interesting one because if we look at, for example, West Indians, who may be black, they tend to, and so therefore, you know, people might think, well, they have the same experience as African Americans. No, not at all. In general, they tend to be more successful in school. They have not been in a subservient or colonized position in this society. So I think that there's something to those theories. But whatever happens, I mean, whatever it is, I think that we need to be very clear that the experience is a very, very different one in Puerto Ricans today. And people can't generalize that mythic experience because it's not even a real experience. You know, the experience that's been mythologized is my parents made it, look at me, you know, so on, or my great-grandparents made it. Well, the great-grandparents usually didn't make it. The dropout rate was 80% at the beginning of the century. They didn't make it. It was the kids who were able to make it. Yes.
Sonia, it struck me as you were giving us the outline of sound pedagogy, you know, what the school should offer for Latino. And it sounds like what I want for my children. It sounds like sound pedagogy for everyone.
Yes.
And I think when we understand that, you know, that it's not something special that's needed for this group of people.
Thank you so much for saying that. In fact, I was going to say that when I was going through that list. I was going to end up with something that Hernán Lafontaine said several years ago. He used to be the superintendent of schools in Hartford, Connecticut, and he was also, in Puerto Rican, he was the principal of the bilingual school where I was a teacher 28 years ago, 27 years ago. It was the first bilingual school in the Northeast. And he spoke a few years ago at the Gaston Institute here in Boston on what is good education for Latino students like. And the last thing that he said was, excellent education for Latinos is excellent education for all children. Who could lose by having caring, affirming teachers? Who could lose by being in a bilingual program and, learning to communicate in 2 languages? Who could lose by any of, looking at any of these policies and practices more critically? All kids could benefit. And so I'm really glad that you brought that up. Thank you. Yes.
I just have a comment when you're talking about teachers, Spanish teachers who teach at high school. I had an incident with my son in high school where I'm Spanish, so I talked at home, and he was being taught a word that he knew was improper. So he came home very upset. So I went to see the teacher, and I said to her, he's coming home saying that this is improper, this is I'm Spanish. So she really got upset at me. She says, I have a master's in education. She said,
That's a good attitude.
she says, I have a master's in education from Spain. And I says, well, I'm not from Spain. I says, I'm from South America, but my son has been taught that this was the wrong way to say the word. And I says, and I wish you would appreciate, his view. And she was very upset. She took me over to another teacher. It was like she was putting me down, and I got really upset. But I left it. I says, okay. I said, since my son has to go to your class, I'm going to let it be. But I want him to know that that's wrong. So going back, that we do hire teachers in the school system that, they don't really teach the proper environment.
Yeah. Or, sometimes, I remember a teacher here in Holyoke who said, but I want them to learn Guajalote. How do you say it? Is that how you say it in Mexican Spanish? It's Turkey. Babo. And, my attitude about that is, the more words you teach kids, the better, of course. But why focus on that when you can say, instead, you say babo, and in Mexico this is what they say. Instead of saying, or the word guagua, like guagua is only used in Puerto Rico to mean bus. Maybe in Uruguay, it's one of those, doesn't it? Oh, really? So it's used to mean bus. Most places it's not.
And I thought we used that as an expression for baby.
For baby, right.
Exactly. So when I talk in Spanish and you say, I can't say wow, because I didn't want it. The way I was brought up is, it's
Well,
a
but
baby.
you can say,
I do.
where I was brought up, it's baby.
I do.
So I think it's good for kids to know, and Puerto Rico se dice guagua, and in a lot of other places we say autobús. That's fine, that enriches everybody. Instead of saying one is right, it's one is wrong.
See, I taught at Berlitz and taught Spanish, and that's the way they taught it. They took words and taught, like in Mexico they say it this way, and in Argentina they say it this way. And I thought that that's the way everyone should learn. Because, if you ever want to travel, unless you have experience with the different words are.
I think the problem that you're highlighting is not with language. It's one of arrogance, and that simply because one has a formal education, it does not mean that one has all the answers. I've often heard people say, él es educado pero no tiene educación. Somebody is educated but doesn't have educación, manners, good attitudes.
Do you have anything to offer suggestions for children that can learn English quicker in the schools? Like if someone's in charge of programming for schools, and any ideas to schools to get children
Okay,
to learn English
what I would
faster?
say? You know what I would say to kids, to families? I would ask families to speak their native language at home. The more they give the kid language, whatever language it is, the better it'll be. I think the worst mistake we can make is to ask parents to speak English to kids at home. But
in the schools,
but I think this is one thing that the schools can do, because if you say, it's not only not saying,
don't say that.
No, it's not.
What can we do in schools to
Right.
help children learn English?
Right.
Faster, because many of your comments were that children need the language.
Yes, they
can
do.
no longer work with their backs in our
Right.
society. So we have several children that stay in bilingual education for 6 years and never come out. And for a major part of their day or parts of their day, do you have a formula for that? Should they have a certain amount of Spanish in their day, or a little bit of English? Would you propose Saturday morning classes in English? And what can you offer as suggestions for children to learn English
I
faster?
don't think there's any formula. I think it really depends on the kid and it depends on the school. And the reason that I want to go back to my first suggestion, I wasn't saying that you were necessarily saying don't speak Spanish at home. But what I am suggesting is that parents need to know that not only is it okay to do that, but that you're encouraging them to do it, that you give them books so that they can do it, and so on. Because the more language kids get, the better it is in terms of their language development, their linguistic development in whatever language. That's why I said that. I think that in some bilingual programs we need to have more English. That's true. That some ESL teachers see their kids 20 minutes a day. That's not enough. That is not enough. You need to really have more exposure to English in some of the programs. I also think that schools need to find a way to have a lot more exchange with the English-speaking kids, and I don't think that they do that enough. That it can only be at lunchtime, serendipitously. It can only be in art or in gym, because then you'll find that the Puerto Rican kids and other Latino kids are here, then you'll find that the English-speaking kids are here, so even if they're in the same space, they're not necessarily sharing. So schools need to find a way to get kids to speak to one another in their own languages, so you promote and foster both languages. So that's what I was saying. And I think I need to get back to parents. So thank you. Okay, so good luck.
Before people leave, I'd like to just say a few things. I'm going to invite you to say, have refreshments, look at resources. Just one thing that I wanted to mention in the Springfield schools, I know that some people are doing wonderful work around the ideas of Luis Mold that Sonia mentioned, bringing the funds of knowledge of parents into the classroom. I know that Joanne Wilson-Keenan is doing some wonderful work with teachers trying to encourage parents to become part of the curriculum creation process. So there's some wonderful practice happening in Springfield, and also experimenting some with the idea of two-way bilingual, which Sonia was mentioning, creating a natural environment where people want to speak English because they have a real need to do so, instead of this sort of artificial environment of an ESL classroom. So there's some really good experiments happening locally around that. The other thing that I wanted to make sure is that everybody leaves with, on this side of the room, there's a yellow bibliography, which is a collection of resources to teach around the Puerto Rican experience, from children's literature to stuff for high school students, to resources for people who just want to learn more about Puerto Rico. And this reflects materials that we've used at the Care Center over the years. And some of the books are here for you to look at. This side of the room is what's called the Holyoke Family Literacy Collection. And all of the books on here, there's 114 titles on here, are accessible to you. They will live at SADES, which is the System for Adult Basic Education Support at Holyoke Community College. So all of these books will be in their library and can be checked out, and I want you to check them out. And this is a collection that has a variety of things. There are parenting resources, ideas for how to integrate themes of family into adult education classes or classes with teens or young children. There's multicultural children's literature, and ideas for how schools and communities and parents can work more closely together. And some of the titles are here for you to look at also. So these you can really see. These are, live at the Care Center, and we use them. And of course, you're welcome to visit anytime. And last but not least, this is a collection. All of these are the products of the last 3 years of this Holyoke Family Literacy Network that we've been part of, which is ending up this summer. And this is a collection of lesson plans. It's called Family Literacy, a collection of lessons. And this is sort of a source book. If you're trying to think about how can I working themes of education and the family. If you work with parents, maybe you have children, maybe you work in adult ed. These are things that we've done with the teen parents at the Care Center to talk about children's learning, how they can support their children's learning, lots of hands-on activities, looking critically at people's own education histories, looking at the Puerto Rican experience. So it's a collection of lessons, and it's in draft form here. If you're interested in getting a copy, you can sign up over there, and we'll call you and let you know when it's ready. It's going to be ready next week. And also there's a fair next Friday all day at Holyoke Community College. It's called a Materials Sharing Fair, and it will be there available too. We'll be selling it at cost, to the printed cost. And there's a flyer about that mini fair if you want to stop by at HCC next Friday, because it'll be lots of teachers' products from a lot of different things that adult education teachers have been doing. So I'm hoping that this work, even though the Family Literacy Network in its current entity will not be around, I'm hoping that these ideas will get carried out into the work that you all are doing in Head Start. I know that Head Start's doing a lot of work with family literacy, and I know many of you are, Ms. Nygren. So I encourage you to keep doing this work. And my last message is, our next event will pick up very logically from where Sonia stopped today. It's with Nitza Hidalgo, who's a professor at Westfield State College, and she's done a lot of research on what it is that Puerto Rican families are doing that support their children's success in school, and she has a very positive focus. And she's doing a lot of research that backs that up. So I think that will be very, very useful for us. So that's June 8th, and there's flyers over there. So if you take a flyer and publicize it, I would really appreciate that. And thank you all for coming. Oh, yes, just a reminder.